Well, welcome everybody. Good afternoon. Our topic for today is about growing tomatoes, peppers, and sweet potatoes, which are three very important crops. They're all warm season crops. Tomatoes and peppers obviously kind of go together. They're in the same family. Sweet potatoes aren't in the same family, but it's such a big, important warm season crop that we like to include that in here. So we'll be talking about all three of these today. Tomatoes are obviously one of the most important and favorite vegetables. I think when they do surveys every year, it's the #1 vegetable that everyone wants to grow. And it all makes sense because the tomatoes in the store just do not have great flavor, especially winter tomatoes. And they're grown differently. They're grown and harvested before they harvest them before they're ripe, and they ripen them artificially. So they never really have great flavor. So that's why everyone, myself included, is really looking forward to having some homegrown tomatoes that taste great. A little bit of background on the tomato family. Includes other members that you might be familiar with, peppers, which we just mentioned, but also potatoes. A lot of people don't know that potatoes are in the same family. Eggplants, tomatillos, and ground cherries. And if you're not familiar with tomatillos and ground cherries, we're not going to talk about them today, but you could Google them and also look at our Seeders Digest. It talks a little bit about the varieties we have of those plants. But they are all fun, and these are all wonderful plants. The name of the tomato family is the Solanaceae. Not that that's important to remember, but just to know that these plants are all in the same family, and it's a good idea to try and move your tomato plants from year to year to different places in your garden and plant them where other types of plants grew previously. That's called rotating your crops. I get this question a lot: are tomatoes fruits or are they vegetables? And if you go to the internet and ask that question, you will get all kinds of answers, most of them which will not be right. The answer is that they are both. And this is how that works. Think about vegetables. Vegetables are any part of a plant that's edible. So when you're eating vegetables, sometimes you're eating the leaves, sometimes you're eating the roots, like with carrots. Sometimes you're eating a stem or a stalk, like with asparagus or celery. Sometimes you're eating a bulb or a tuber. Bulbs would be like onions, tubers like potatoes. And then sometimes you're eating the seeds. If you're eating peas or corn, you're eating the seeds. So these are all edible parts of the plant. And yet another edible part of a plant is sometimes the fruit. And the fruit comes from when the flower is pollinated. So other fruits that we eat that you might not think of as vegetables would be things like peppers, squash, cucumbers, melons. Those are all vegetables and they're all fruits. Because fruit is just a particular type of vegetable that, as I mentioned, is a result of when a flower has been pollinated. And generally they're fleshy and sweet and they contain seeds. Again, typical fruits: apples, peaches, pears, etc., cantaloupe, watermelon. But the other things that we often just think are vegetables, but are also fruits, are tomatoes, peppers, eggplants, squash, pumpkins, cucumbers, snap peas, and green beans. So there's the answer to that all important question. As far as how to grow tomatoes, they have some basic requirements, not that different from just any basic garden plant. They need good sunlight. Full sun is important, good soil, warm temperatures, and of course, all plants need sufficient supply of water. Full sun is the best for tomatoes. I often get people saying, my yard is really shady. Can I still grow tomatoes? And the answer is yes, you can, but you may not get as many tomatoes. You might not get as much fruit because fruiting crops like tomatoes, peppers, eggplants, also melons and cucumbers, they all need full sun if you're going to get full production. So if you don't have this full sun, you can still grow them. You just may not get as many fruits. And of course, good soil has some different characteristics. One is pH. That refers to how acid or alkaline the soil is. And typically, you want your soil just a little on the acid side. That's in that 5.5 to 7.0 range. 7.0 is neutral. Lots of our soils around here are a little on the alkaline side and would benefit from a little soil amendment using some sulfur to bring the pH down a little bit. And that's where a soil test can be useful. We'll talk more about that in our soil workshop. The other thing is just good soil drainage. That just means you don't want the soil to hold too much water and stay wet too long, because plants need to dry out. They can't live, roots can't survive in constant water conditions. And then, of course, lots of organic matter. As I talk about in almost every workshop, organic matter is the thing that really makes soil good for plant growth, and there's lots of wonderful things for all the little microorganisms that are trying to grow in your soil as well. Warm temperatures, you know, we talk about cool season vegetables and warm season vegetables. Tomatoes are definitely a warm season vegetable. They need warm air temperatures and they need warm soil temperatures. And lots of times in the spring, people say, my tomatoes aren't really growing yet and it's warm outside, but my tomatoes just aren't taking off. And sometimes that's because the soil is still cool and you actually need the soil to warm up before planting. Some people say that's even more important than air temperatures, but they are both important. And also typically in the spring, we have lots of cool nights, and especially around the beginning of tomato planting time. And kind of a signal to watch is look for at least 3 consecutive nights where the temperature is 50 degrees or higher before you plant. If you're not seeing that happen on a consistent basis, the above 50 degrees at night, it's not gonna, your tomatoes are not gonna do well. It's just too early. As far as ideal temperatures for tomatoes, this is more like once you get to summer and it's really warm out, the ideal temperatures is in the 80s for tomatoes. They love in the 80s because that's when they really start growing fast. So 80 to 85 is pretty perfect. Nighttime temperatures, 65 to 70 is pretty ideal for tomatoes. Now, at the beginning of the season, you're not going to get that. It's not going to be that warm at night. And then, of course, the soil temperature, you can think of like 70 degrees would be ideal, 60 degrees for a minimum. So some people say, do not plant your tomatoes until your soil temperature has reached at least 60 degrees. You can actually use a soil thermometer to test how warm the soil is, and you can actually warm up the soil before you plant your tomatoes by putting some plastic down. Some clear plastic will help warm up that soil and get it ready for planting. You see this little picture of the tomato in the lower right-hand corner here. It's got a thermometer in it. Just so you know, you do not need to stick a thermometer in your tomatoes. This is just to let you know that tomatoes are temperature sensitive and are affected by too cool and too warm. The other thing is if you get too warm a temperatures during this summer, like up in the 90s, what happens then is the plants continue to grow, but lots of times the blossoms will not set fruit in the upper 90s. And so sometimes you'll have a period of really warm days, hot days, where it's in the upper 90s for a week or so, and you'll notice that your tomato production drops off. They're not setting any tomatoes on. That's because the blossoms are falling off and not getting pollinated. The other thing is people think as long as it's not frosting, my tomatoes are okay, but actually tomatoes plants will get injured at the low 40s. And that's what we call chilling injury. It doesn't actually kill the plant, but it affects its growth. It will stunt the growth of the plant. So definitely want to avoid the temperatures in the 30s and the 40s. And that's why it would be such a mistake to plant tomatoes right now. And if you go to garden centers or some of the big box hardware stores, you will see tomato plants starting to come in and, you know, they're selling them. People are thinking, oh, great, I can go ahead and plant them now. But that's just because they want to sell as many tomato plants as they can, and they're not concerned about how successful you are as much. We tell people not to plant until it's warm enough. We'll talk about that a little bit more on the timing in a little bit. As far as watering, tomatoes need, like your average garden plant, 1 inch to 1.5 inches per week. So that's why it's a good idea to have a rain gauge to keep track of how much rain you actually get. Lots of times it looks like it's raining a lot, but you're not getting that much. So if it doesn't rain that much, you want to add by watering by hand or with a sprinkler so that you have more water, so you get up to this inch to inch and a half. And usually I think probably an inch is more important in the beginning of the season when it's cooler. When it gets really hot in the summer, that's when it's probably more important to get that inch and a half. And also a couple of just tips is to avoid wetting the leaves as much as possible when you're watering, and that's so that you don't spread tomato diseases. Sometimes it's spread by watering the leaves. Obviously, when it rains, you can't avoid getting the leaves wet, but you can avoid getting the leaves wet when you're watering, and just water at the base of the plant, down to the ground. The other thing that will just help a lot with your tomato watering is to mulch. It will reduce the water evaporation and just make your water last a lot longer. You won't need to water as often. It'll keep the soil cooler in hot, hot summer when the soil gets too warm. And so mulch is just a great, great thing to be doing for your tomatoes and the rest of your garden plants. As far as when to plant, again, they start selling them really early. You can probably go buy them right now at some places, but it's too early. I usually think of a target date of about May 1st to May 7th. And usually in there somewhere, there'll be good time for planting. Last year was a little unusual. We were still having cold weather and some frost, even after May 7th. I think it was even Mother's Day, we still had frost, which is highly unusual. Usually by May 1st, we're pretty good. Probably the earliest I would aim for would be about April 24th. Here you see the overall planting window. Somewhere between April 24th and June 20th, you should be planting your tomatoes. The other thing is you don't need to plant all your tomatoes at once. I actually recommend that people plant some early, about May 1st, and then plant some later, about May 25th or even June 1st. And that will give you lots of really nice tomatoes for later in the season when your first tomato plants. The early ones are maybe kind of giving up. Sometimes they give up, towards the end of the season. If you are going to plant early, in April, and even at the beginning of May, I tell people watch the 10-day forecast for the cool temperature extremes. Watch out for those 30s and 40s. If you see 30s and 40s in the 10-day forecast coming up, I would hold off because you're going to get chilling injury to your tomato plants, and it will affect the production of them as going forward for the whole year. And again, you can warm the soil up beforehand by putting out some plastic over your bed, get it tilled up, get it raked, ready to plant, and then put some plastic over it. That'll keep it warm, but it'll also keep it dry so that when it's time, you'll be able to go out and plant, even if it's rained a lot. And if you do have cold temperatures after you plant, you want to protect your plants, and we'll talk a little bit about how you can do that. In fact, here's the slide right here. So there's some little things you can put around tomato plants. One is row cover. I'll show you a picture of that here in a minute. Some people also use milk jugs, the kind of white plastic milk jugs, the ones that you can let a little light through, but you can't see clear through them. And people will take the lid off of it and cut out the bottom and put that around their tomato plant. And it makes kind of a little mini greenhouse and helps keep the tomatoes warmer, especially during the cold extremes. There's also a thing called the wall of water. That's what this picture is here. This is made out of plastic. It comes in a little circle, and the plastic is woven together to make little tubes. And the tubes, you fill them with water, about 3/4 full. And then during the day, you have it open, like you see in this picture. But then at night, you kind of push these tubes all together and close the top up, and that will protect it overnight. And that actually, it seems like kind of a gimmick, but can probably help you get by some cooler temperatures and will get your tomato plants growing faster, especially at the beginning of the season. And then after a certain point, you take them off once they start getting, your tomato plants start getting big, because they're going to outgrow it, and at that point you won't need it. Same thing with the milk jugs. They will outgrow them, and then you remove the milk jugs. The other thing that's probably a little easier to manage is row cover. And we've talked about this in our basic gardening class, and also the extending the season class that we do. It's really just a white fabric that lets sunlight in. It also lets water in. It comes in long sheets. You can buy it online, or you can buy it here at the community gardens. We sell it by the foot. It provides frost protection, but also will just make it warmer under there. Sometimes people get the idea that you could also just use like clear plastic, make yourself a little greenhouse and put that over your plants, but that does not work well at all. It gets way too hot under there and will actually cook and damage your plants because the temperature will get too high. This will give you about 4 to 5 degrees temperature difference at night. Will protect your plants from the cooler temperatures. Can even protect from frost, but even remember, temperatures in the 40s are not good for tomato plants. So the row cover, you can put up little supports, little plastic hoops to protect it, or you can even just lay it over the plants gently because it's so lightweight that it won't hurt the leaves. As far as taking care of your tomatoes from beginning to end throughout the crop cycle, this is kind of the cycle, what it looks like. You can start your own tomato plants. If you want to do that, if you have a greenhouse, most people don't have a greenhouse, but you can start your own tomato plants if you want under lights, fluorescent lights, or the new LED tube lights that they have that replace the old fluorescent lights. Those all work great. And we actually did a class earlier on starting seeds indoors under lights. You can go look that up on our website. It's probably getting to be almost a little late for tomatoes starting your own at this point because you're going to be wanting to plant them for too long. Takes about 5 to 6 weeks from planting the seeds until you get a transplant that's ready to put out in your garden. Most people prefer, just because it's easier, just to buy their transplants. You don't have to worry about trying to grow them in the greenhouse or growing them under lights, and it's easy. Just come to a garden center. KCCG sells tomato plants to members. You want to pick plants that look healthy. They're dark green, fairly compact, not too tall and stretched out and skinny looking. You also want to avoid ones that have been in their little pots too long. Typically, they grow them in cell packs, like a 3-pack or a 4-pack or a 6-pack. And if they're in there too long, the roots get all bound up, and it makes it hard for the roots to move out into the soil once you transplant the plant into your garden. But there's ways to help that process. We'll talk about that here in a minute. The other thing that I do recommend to people is what we call hardening off. And all that means is you're getting your plants used to the outdoors, because they've been in a greenhouse where it's been in the 80s. The nighttime temperatures have been 65. And then you're going to put this plant outside, and the sunlight's actually going to be a little stronger outside than it is in the greenhouse. It's going to be windy. The daytime temperatures are going to maybe be in the 50s and 60s. The nighttime temperatures are ideally going to be at least 50, but 50 is a lot different from 65. So it's a little bit of a shock to the plant. It's not used to these cooler temperatures. So what I recommend to people is to gradually get your plants used to being outside. And so usually what I tell people is put them outside the first day after you buy your plants. Put them outside for the first day, maybe 1 hour. If it's nice out, you can put them a couple hours out. You could also put them in the shade outside for a longer period of time. Like if you have to go to work, you put them outdoors in the shade, and that will get them used to the temperatures, and gradually they'll get used to the stronger light. But each day increase the amount of time they're going outside. Like the first day might be an hour, the next day 2 hours, then 4 hours, then 6 hours, and then 8 hours. And then you're still just bringing them at night until it's time to plant. At this point, they can be out all the time. But when they're not outside, you want to put them in a sunny window where they're still getting pretty good light. So this whole process ideally will take, maybe 4 or 5 days, and then you'll be able to put your plants out in the garden. Keep an eye on that 10-day forecast so you know when the right time for planting. And actually, one more thing, if If the weather is not cooperating and the night times are still too cold, but the daytimes are okay, just keep putting your plants out during the day and make sure that you keep watering them. You don't want them to go dry, and just keep them outside so they're getting good light. Don't try and keep them indoors all the time, as long as the temperatures are warm enough to be outdoors. All right, let's talk about planting the tomato plants. You want to prepare the soil. Of course, you till it up ahead of time. I recommend doing it ahead of time so you're ready. Think about rotating your crops, putting them in a different place than you had last year. I like to water the plants, in their little 3-packs or 4-packs or whatever. Water them so that they're moist when you put them out. And then again, talk about the roots being bound up. So I tell people to rough up the root ball. And all that means is to loosen up the roots. And so I'll take scissors and I'll actually snip the sides of the little roots. And then I'll use the scissors to kind of untangle the roots so they're branching out and spreading out, so that when you put them into the soil, they'll spread out fast into the ground. And of course, spacing them properly, and don't plant them too close together. Planting with proper depth. I like to recommend using some mulch around them. And then of course, after you plant, you want to water them and use a little lukewarm water. As far as the spacing goes, it's really important to get them spaced properly. I usually tell people give them 30 inches at least apart to 36 inches. Some people like to put them closer. I like to give my tomatoes room so they have lots of room, because tomatoes get big, and also just makes it easier for you to get in there and pick those tomatoes if they aren't all bunched up together. So that's for plants in cages. We'll talk about how to grow tomatoes in cages and stakes. If you're staking your tomatoes, they can go closer because you're going to be pruning that plant so that it's a single stalk. So staked tomatoes can be about 18 inches apart. As far as just taking care of your tomato plants after you plant them until the point when they start fruiting, this is called the vegetative phase, because it's just growing green leaves during that time. So at this point, you're going to be doing watering, you'll be mulching, controlling the weeds, doing maybe some fertilizer. You're going to be supporting the plants so that they won't fall over and flop down. You're going to maybe do some pruning if you're going to stake your plants. And then just protecting them from diseases, insects, and other pests. So tomatoes sometimes are called vines, but they aren't a true vine, and they won't climb all by themselves. They need something to climb on. And the thing that works the best, I think, are tomato cages. But as mentioned, there's other ways to do it. Tying them to a stake. We'll talk about that here in a minute. Talk about the cages. There's some trellises you can use. There's a basket weave technique that some commercial growers are used, and some homeowners also. Sometimes people will buy what they call a tomato tower. I'm not super impressed with them, or the tomato spiral. You can look those up on the internet. They're just kind of a different version of a cage or a trellis thing, but I don't think they work as well as the cages. And then some people actually still don't don't have support for their tomatoes. They'll just put down a thick layer of mulch and let the tomatoes grow out on that, which I do not recommend, just because the fruit will sit on the ground. Even if they're sitting on top of mulch, they tend to rot. And it's just hard to get in there. The tomatoes don't produce as much. So they really do need some kind of support. And tomato cages, I think, are the best way to go. The staking tomatoes is within a lot more in the past. People thought you had to do it this way. And you would trim this tomato plant to a single main stem, cut off all the side branches, which are called suckers. So I'll show you that picture here in a minute. If you do this, you need pretty sturdy stakes, about 8 feet tall, and you need to pound them into the ground about 2 feet so they'll be sturdy and stay in the ground to anchor that tomato plant when it gets big and heavy. And then you're going to be tying the tomato plant to it. So you're going to remove all the little side branches. If you look at this picture here, you can see the person's hand right there. There is a little tiny side branch starting to come out right where the joint is of a leaf, and that's called a sucker or a side branch, a side shoot. Here you can see down here when it's a little longer. And if you're doing the stake, you're supposed to take all of those out, so you just have this main stalk going up, and that's the thing you're going to tie to the stake. In my mind, that's a lot of work, and you don't actually get as many tomatoes. It's easy to do it in the cage. The one thing though, if you're looking for like giant prize winning extra big tomatoes, this will get you bigger tomatoes, just not as many of them. The basket weave support system is one that a lot of the local tomato growers use when they're growing for market, just because it's cheaper than tomato cages. Basically, you have stakes with this kind of rope or twine tied between, and it's tied at different levels, but there's two tied together. And what you do is, as the tomato plant grows up, you tuck it in between those two things. You pull those two sets of rope or twine apart, and then let the tomato plant grow up in the middle. And as the tomato plant keeps growing up taller and taller, you have to make sure you get it to feed into those in between those two strings. Otherwise, it'll start to fall over. If you wait too long, it'll be hard. But some people really like this system. I still prefer cages, but this can work really well for you if you do it properly. As far as caging tomato plants, so they do need to be tall cages and strong cages, and they need to be adequately anchored. Usually the cages you buy at the store are just not good enough. They're inadequate. It's best to make your own. We also sell them here at community gardens from the material that we like, which is called concrete reinforcing wire. It's what they use when they are making like a patio or a sidewalk. They put this wire down, and that helps hold the concrete together, but also works great for making tomato cages. The other thing you want to do is at the end, when you put the cage up, you want to put a stake in it. We'll talk about that here in a minute. Here's tomato cages. On the left, you'll see what you usually see at the store, this kind of flimsy looking wire thing. Sometimes they're even only 2 rings, but sometimes they're 3 rings. Occasionally you'll see 4 rings. But when you stick them into the ground, they're only about 30 inches high. And unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you look at it, tomatoes get much taller than that. They'll get 5 feet, 6 feet, sometimes even 7 feet tall. So the concrete reinforcing wire is 5 feet tall. So that gets you up pretty high. And then tomatoes will kind of grow up a little bit higher than that, and then they'll just kind of hang over at that point. So anyhow, you shape it into a circle. You have to have some good wire cutters, or actually I like to use bolt cutters to cut the wire. You can buy the rolls of wire at places like Home Depot or Lowe's. It's expensive to buy a big roll of it. You may not need that many. That's why sometimes it's easier just to buy tomato cages like from here at Community Gardens. We will have those for a limited time in the spring. Check on our website for information about tomato cage purchases. And this wire is not galvanized, so it does get rusty, but it will last for a long, long time. And I have tomato cages that are over 20 years old. The other thing is you want to take either a wooden stake or a piece of concrete reinforcing wire. Concrete reinforcing rod, or a small T-post works well too, and drive that in right next to where the tomato cage is going to be, and then use some zip ties to fasten the cage to the stake. And that way, when your tomato plant gets big and heavy and loaded with tomatoes, and it gets windy, they're not going to fall over and break your plants. So the other thing, as far as crop protection, people worry about insects. There aren't actually a whole lot of insects that bother tomatoes. And here's pictures of some of them. One is the tomato hornworm. It's this big fat caterpillar that eats leaves. And you won't see this all the time, just occasionally. You'll notice that some of your leaves are missing, and you'll find this big fat caterpillar, and you can just pick that thing off and get rid of it. The other one is a smaller caterpillar called the fruit worm, and it doesn't eat the leaves, but it actually bores into the fruit. And so if you see little holes bored into your tomatoes, your green tomatoes, usually that's a tomato fruit worm that's in there. And of course that ruins your tomatoes, so it's not a good thing. And even these you don't see all the time. It's not something you see every year. But something that does happen every year pretty much would be spider mites, and to a lesser degree aphids. Aphids is what you see on the right here. They're little tiny. These ones are brown or reddish. Often they're just green. They're little tiny bugs that you'll see usually at the tips of the tomato plant where it's really succulent. And they feed on the sap of the tomato plant. They can spread diseases. So there's some easy organic sprays that you can use to control them. The other one is spider mites, and you don't typically see these because they are so tiny. They look like miniature spiders. They're related to spiders, and they also suck the sap of the tomato plant, and they typically live on the underside of the leaves, and they particularly grow when it gets really warm and dry. So in the later summer, when the temperatures get up in the 90s, we don't have rain, that's when you're likely to see outbreaks of spider mites on your tomato plants. And you don't really see the little critters until you start noticing that your plants maybe have little white spots on them. And you look at the back and you see little yellow spots that are developing from that. And the plants just get weaker and weaker. And in really bad years, it can just really affect the tomato plants really badly. So there's some organic sprays that you can use to help control that also. So it's just something to keep an eye on, and especially in the late hot summer when it's very dry. Of course, other pests, the biggest ones I hear about would be squirrels. Squirrels are famous for eating tomatoes. They like to take a bite or two out of a really nice looking tomato that's just getting ready to turn ripe, or sometimes even before they turn ripe, and they'll just drop the rest of it on the ground. Some people think that they're just after moisture, and if you put out a little dish of water, they will go after drinking the water and you will leave your tomatoes alone. I have not found that to be true, and most people have not found that to be true. I'm not saying it wouldn't help. What some people do to protect their tomatoes from squirrels would be to actually make a large sort of cage area around your whole tomato crop. Like put up some 2x4s, get some either netting or some like chicken wire, and just totally enclose the sides and over the top, because squirrels can just jump in from trees nearby, and just totally cover up the tomato plants with this wire enclosure, and then make yourself just a little door so you can get in and out. That is like the ultimate solution. Some people will do trapping. They'll live trap the squirrels and then try to relocate them. That can be hard, and also there's some legal issues there. Some people use squirrel repellents. I don't know of any that work really super great at this point, but it's worth trying, and they're coming out with new materials all the time. Some people will discourage them with a pellet gun, but again, in the city, that's a dangerous thing to do. Some people have good luck if you have a good cat that prowls around, or a good dog in the yard to chase the squirrels away. So that can work. The other thing that I don't really have a lot of data on right now, but I've been hearing about it for several years, and it looked like they had a product on the market a couple years ago, but now I'm not seeing it, is a product that you put out that's a bait that actually is a birth control for squirrels. Sounds kind of crazy, but what it does, it stops them from reproducing. So eventually the squirrels die out, and you don't have. But in big neighborhoods where there's lots of oak trees, especially those pin oak trees, you're always going to have squirrels. So you need to figure out what's the best way for you to deal with that. One thing that I found is having cherry tomatoes. If you plant cherry tomatoes, they will still eat some of them, but there are so many cherry tomatoes that you will probably still get all you need, even though the squirrels get a few. And hopefully they'll take those and not take your big tomatoes that you're trying to grow. There is also lots of tomato diseases, and one that I hear of frequently and see that gardeners have is called blossom end rot. It's caused by inconsistent watering. When we have dry periods and wet period, dry period and wet period, and you can help this by putting mulch down. That'll keep the soil more evenly moist. Once you see this black spot developing on the bottom of your tomato, you need to just pluck it off and throw it away, because it's not going to get any better. The tomato itself may start to ripen. It might look like it's good, but eventually it rots even more. And when it gets really bad, it looks like this over here on the right. So just even when that little starts just a little bit, you might as well just go ahead and remove that tomato. As far as diseases, there's lots of different diseases. Fusarium wilt, verticillium wilt. You get your tomato leaves, start wilting because of the fungus. And these diseases are actually carried over in the soil. So your best bet here is to rotate your crops and also to plant disease-resistant tomatoes. That can make a huge difference. Some of the old heirloom varieties, in fact, most of them are not disease-resistant, and so they struggle with these tomato diseases year after year. But to prevent that, again, plant resistant varieties. Mulching the soil will help because that will not stop the soil. It'll stop the soil from splashing up when you water and on the leaves. Again, water the soil, not the leaves. You can use some fungicides. There's some dust or sprays, typically like copper, that you can put on that will help stop the fungus from growing. If you have a really diseased plant, you should just remove it. And again, don't plant in the same location year after year. Move your tomatoes around to different locations within your garden. Some people are growing a new type of plant. You might hear about these. It's called a grafted tomato plant. Because the heirloom varieties that I mentioned, again, are not disease resistant. So they found a way that you can grow them and get some disease resistance. What they do is they take a seedling of a heirloom variety, something like the Cherokee Purple or the Brandywine, and they'll cut the top off of it and then take a seedling of a disease resistant tomato that has a good healthy root system, and they'll actually take the top of the heirloom variety and cut it and stick it into the little cut off part of the rootstock, the disease resistant part. Here you can see in the picture. And they splice it in there, and then they wrap it and hold it together, and then eventually it grows together. And this is like what they do with fruit trees, graft them. But anyhow, they recently started doing that with tomatoes. What this gets you is a really great variety on top, which will be the heirloom variety, the Cherokee Purple or whatever, but it'll have this healthy disease-resistant root system. So it'll give you disease resistance, very productive. The thing is that they're very expensive because this is a process that has to be done by hand. You have to do it in the greenhouse. It takes time. So typically these tomato plants will cost about $10 is what I've been seeing. There's some places that might have a little bit cheaper. So, if you're going to buy 6 tomato plants and spend $10 each, that's a lot of money. So you don't need to do this unless you're just wanting really badly to try and grow those heirloom varieties and have them be extra disease resistant. Because you can certainly just plant regular seedlings and just try and deal with the disease as you grow them. All right. Types of tomatoes. There are heirlooms, there are hybrids. Lots of times people think the heirlooms are better because they're not genetically modified. But typically the hybrids that you buy, they are not genetically modified. They've just been bred to produce disease resistance and good production. The thing is with the hybrids, you can't save the seeds from them and try and get the same type of tomato. The heirlooms, you can save your own seeds if that's something that interests you. But there's different kinds. There's, of course, paste tomatoes like Romas. There's what we call salad tomatoes, which is a smaller tomato. There's the big slicer tomatoes that are for slices. And then the smaller tomatoes, the really tiny ones, of course, cherry tomatoes people are familiar with. There's also some that are even smaller and shaped more like grapes. And then there's the little tiny, even smaller ones called currant tomatoes that are really tiny. And then there's also a type of tomato you don't hear very much about anymore, but it was a thing and you can still buy them. It's called a long keeper. It's a tomato that you plant a little bit later in the season, and at the end of the season, you pick the green ones and the ones that are just starting to turn color and bring them inside, and they actually ripen. I mean, a regular tomato will do this too, but the flavor isn't always as good. But this actually ripens and keeps for a long period of time, sometimes even 2 or 3 months. if you're trying to get some nice, fresh, good tomatoes over the fall and winter. So something kind of interesting to try. As far as choosing varieties, there are so many different tomato varieties. There are whole catalogs just devoted to tomatoes. And again, I like to pick ones that are disease resistant. You'll see initials after a variety. We see this in our catalog and other catalogs. It'll say like VF or sometimes VFN, or sometimes even more initials like VFNAPT. And these are all different diseases that affect tomatoes, and this means they are disease resistant. Flavor, of course, is important because tomatoes in the stores are just, really not good flavor. You want to grow nice flavored tomatoes. You want them to be productive. And then again, the type that you want. Are you looking for a cherry tomato? Are you looking for a paste tomato that you can make your own sauces? And also, how many days does it take to harvest? Some tomatoes are fairly early and take maybe 65 days. Other ones take longer, might take 95 or even 100 days. So especially some of the old heirloom varieties take a long, long time to produce. There is a new tomato variety that we've added here at the community gardens. We'll have in limited amounts. It's called the Iron Lady. And what's special about it is that it has the most disease resistance of any tomato that's ever been produced. It's just something that they've been working on to breed. It's not genetically modified by gene transfers or anything like that. And it's resistant to the common diseases, the verticillium and the fusarium, like many tomatoes have that resistance. But in addition, it's also resistant to the other 3 diseases listed there: early blight, late blight, and septoria leaf spot, which are all different fungus diseases. And there's never been a tomato that has all these different disease resistances together. So that's why they call it Iron Lady. We'll have some plants this year. It's a medium-sized tomato. It's a slicer. It's about 5 ounces. The flavor is good. I haven't actually tried it yet, but the reviews are all really good. And again, it's very disease resistant. As far as harvesting and storage, tomatoes, it's ideal if you can ripen them on the vine. But sometimes people like to ripen them off the vine. And if you're going to do that, what you want to do is let them get just a little bit of color, like in this picture. See how these tomatoes have just a little bit of red start showing here. If you pick one at that stage, it will still ripen indoors off the vine and have good flavor. It doesn't need sunshine for that. Just warm temperatures in your house. If you pick one that's totally green, like this one on the right here, it will not develop good flavor. So that's why you want to wait till it at least get a little bit of color before you harvest them. And this can be a useful technique if you are having problems with squirrels. Once they get a little bit of color, you bring them in before the squirrels can get to them. As far as processing and preservation, a lot of people like to can tomatoes. You can can whole tomatoes. You can can tomato sauce. You can make salsa. You can also freeze, because canning is fairly complicated. You have to follow lots of exact instructions to do it right. But you can also just freeze your own tomato sauce in little freezer containers. You can make your own salsa and just freeze that in small batches. And you can also actually freeze whole tomatoes. There's a way to do that. They recommend taking the skins off of them first and then freezing them individually. But you can do that, and then you can use them for cooking later. All right, moving along, we've got to get to peppers. Just so you know, this workshop does last a little bit longer, but the tomato part is the biggest part. A lot of the information that applies to tomatoes will also apply to our peppers, so we won't spend as much time on some of that. And then we're still going to be talking about sweet potatoes here at the end. So if you can't stay for the whole workshop, you will be able to watch it online later. Again, peppers are in the tomato family, so they're part of that same group. They don't get diseases quite as much as the tomatoes, so it's not a big a deal as far as rotating your crops, but still, it's just worth being aware of. Tomatoes are a fruit. They're lovely. I mean, I would have to say a red pepper is one of my favorite vegetables. And they're pretty expensive in the grocery store, so you can grow your own. You know, when you go to the grocery store, and I don't know what they're going to cost this year, but typically in the past, a big red bell pepper is like $1 to $1.50, sometimes more. You can grow your own and have all the red peppers you want. A little bit of background: sweet peppers versus hot peppers. There is a plant compound called capsaicin. That's what gives the heat to hot peppers and chili peppers. They measure that in Scoville units. That's how they measure how hot they are. A lot of people are really into the super hot ones. I am not. A jalapeno is actually more than hot enough for me. Anaheims, I like them. I like anchos. The habanero peppers are dangerously hot. We do carry them here, but I do not recommend anyone growing a habanero who has never tasted one, because they are so hot. And especially if there's children around, because they could accidentally take a bite of a habanero pepper and you could end up having to go to the emergency room. Not so much because they're going to have the life or death situation, but because it is so painful and frightening that for children, it's just a terrible experience. Just so you know, a habanero pepper is about 1,000 times as hot as a jalapeno pepper. So taste the jalapeno pepper and think of something 1,000 times hotter than that. And then there's new peppers. I say newer varieties called ghost peppers and other ones that are related. They're even hotter than the habanero pepper. So don't even go there. It's a bad idea. As far as green peppers versus red peppers, a lot of people are under the misconception that they're just different varieties. But basically, when you see a green bell pepper, that is just a bell pepper that hasn't ripened yet. And as it ripens, it'll turn red, or sometimes it'll turn yellow or orange, depending on what the variety is. There's even some that are kind of brown, chocolate looking. There's purple ones. So there's lots of different colors, but red is typical. The interesting thing is when, you know, green pepper has a certain amount of vitamin C in it. It's fairly healthy. But when it turns red, the vitamin C content increases dramatically. So it's much healthier for you. But because it takes longer, that's why they're more expensive in the grocery store. I think they taste better. They're sweeter. Some people also have digestive issues when they eat the green bell peppers because they're not ripe. So that's just a factor. And it's not just the bell peppers, it's also in the hot peppers, like chilies, like your Anaheims, your anchos, your jalapenos. They all start out green, and then as they ripen, they turn red or sometimes yellow. Oops, wrong way. As far as keys to success, these are the things that will help you be successful growing peppers. For bell peppers, you want to plant hybrid varieties, and that's the ones that we will be carrying here at Community Gardens. Things like the Big Bertha, the Red Knight, the Gypsy, those are all hybrid peppers that have just been bred to be very productive. Typically for the hot peppers, they are not hybrids. That's how it works, basically. But again, full sun, very important for growing peppers, just like tomatoes. Good soil, warm temperatures. Spacing is important. They can grow closer than tomatoes, obviously, 16 inches to 18 inches apart. And when you have that young plant, it's good to have some nitrogen fertilizer to grow a big plant that will hold a lot of peppers as they grow up. And mulching is important. And of course, harvesting is important. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. But peppers are one of the easiest vegetables to grow. They just don't have as much disease problems. There's not as much insect problems. You don't have to stake them or trellis them. Sometimes if you get a really tall pepper plant and it's loaded with lots of peppers, it can get heavy. And so sometimes I will put a little stake in there. I've even seen people put a small tomato cage around the peppers to hold it up. And that way it's sturdy and the weight of the peppers they fall over. They also just have a long season. You know, they'll just keep on producing all the way up to frost. In fact, in the fall, lots of times that's when you get a whole bunch of peppers all at once, which is great because then you can put them in your refrigerator and keep them for quite a while and make your summer garden produce last longer. There is a variety that I like a lot. It's called the Gypsy Pepper. It's not the biggest bell pepper. It's considered a bell, although sometimes they're a little bit pointy at one end. It's a Hungarian type pepper. It's very productive. It ripens early. It's extra sweet when it does turn red. And it actually has kind of multicolor ripening. I don't know if you've seen banana peppers, it's related to, but they start out kind of lime green. It's supposed to be dark green, and then they turn kind of butter yellow. And then they'll ripen a little bit more and turn orange. And then eventually, when they're completely ripe, they'll turn red. It's also just very productive during the summer heat because it's a hybrid. So lots and lots of peppers, and they bear early. As far as harvesting and storage, peppers ripen mostly just on the plant, not like tomatoes will ripen off. Now, I have seen peppers that are starting to turn red. You know, sometimes if you leave them, you know, on the counter, they'll ripen a little bit more red. Sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't. The important thing to know about it when you're harvesting, though, is to either twist them off or use clippers. And when I say twist off, literally you're just turning that pepper in a circle, almost like you're winding a clock or something, until it just comes loose. If you just try to snap it off with your hand, 9 times out of 10, you will break the branch of that plant, and that means it won't have more peppers on that branch because you've broken it. The easiest way, I think, for most people is to use a clippers, like a pruning shears or a little floral shears, just to clip that little pepper off, and that way you're not damaging the plant. And you do want to store your peppers in the refrigerator just because they will last much longer and stay fresh and crisp. As far as processing, you can can peppers, but they have to be pickled because they need acid in order to be safely canned. So if you see canned peppers, they've been pickled. You can also freeze peppers. It's pretty easy to do. They don't have to be blanched. Blanching is where you heat them up in hot water first and then freeze them. You can also dry them. In fact, a lot of people aren't aware of this, but basically chili powder is not some special blend of spices. It's basically dried chili peppers, which have been ground and powdered. Lots of times they use anchos for that. And then paprika is dried red sweet peppers, typically of Hungarian type. And so that's why it's sweeter. Both of these are used as flavorings and spices. Also, sometimes you'll just see dried peppers hanging up, and then people will add them to soups and stews and things like that. All right, now we're going to talk about sweet potatoes. Sweet potatoes are in a different family, the morning glory family. Sometimes you'll see a flower on a sweet potato vine and it'll look just like morning glories that you've seen, and that's why, because they're in the same family. Origins, they come from Central and South America. They definitely are a warm season vegetable. They do not like the cool season at all. So if you plant them too early, they will fail. And then when frost comes, it's one of the first plants to get hit by cold temperatures in the fall. They do take a long growing period. So you're going to plant them early, hopefully sometime early to middle May. And then they'll just grow all through May, all through June, all through July, all through August, and then through a good part of September when you harvest them at the end of the season. So the harvest comes all at once. At the end, you dig them up, then you store them, and they last for a long time. As far as what is a sweet potato, it's actually a storage structure that the plant uses to store energy so that it can grow in future years after a drought period or after a cold period. Easy. But it's not actually a root or a tuber. It's what they call a tuberous root, which meaning it's a root that swells and gets fleshy and thick and stores a lot of plant energy inside of it. So you can actually take a sweet potato and just plant it and use that for starting new plants. But it's different than a what we call Irish potatoes or white potatoes, which are actually just tubers as opposed to a tuberous root. Also, sometimes you'll hear people talking about yams, and there's a lot of confusion regarding the names here. A true yam is not really grown very much in the United States. They are a very tropical vegetable. Most people here have never eaten a yam. If they've eaten yams, what they think are yams, those are just sweet potatoes. So here's a picture of somebody holding a yam. It's actually much larger than a sweet potato. It's dark. It doesn't have the nice orange color. They're not as nutritious. They're starchier, and they take much longer to grow, and they're just weird looking. So I'm not trying to discourage you from ever trying to eat a yam or grow a yam. I'm just telling you that it's not the sweet potato. So when you see like canned sweet potatoes, and they call them canned yams, that's actually just sometimes referring to the orange regular sweet potatoes that are moist flesh, and they call those the yams sometimes, but they're not true yams. They are sweet potatoes. Valuable quality of sweet potatoes. They're very nutritious. They have a high nutrient density of vitamins and minerals and other good things. They have a long storage life, probably the longest storage life of any vegetable I know. And they don't need special conditions. In fact, some people try to put them in the refrigerator, and that makes them not last as long because it's too cold for them. You can just set a sweet potato literally out on the kitchen counter, and it will last for months. Sometimes 9 months, sometimes even up to a year, which is pretty amazing. Also pretty easy to grow, very productive, and very versatile. You can use them in many ways. You can make mashed sweet potatoes. You can make sweet potato fries. There's all kinds of sweet potato casseroles. There's recipes for sweet potato muffins and sweet potato cookies and sweet potato cake. So lots of options, and they're just really, really good. So I recommend this. If you're only going to grow 4 or 5 vegetables in your garden, I would recommend sweet potatoes being one of them. The nutrition value, as I mentioned, is very high. It's a complex carbohydrate. There's lots of good fiber, lots of good beta carotene, which is the precursor to vitamin A. Actually, for a vegetable, has a fair amount of protein, a good source of iron and calcium and vitamin C and vitamin B6. So really, really good. There are some varieties you might hear of called white flesh sweet potatoes, and some people grew up liking those. They are not actually as nutritious because they don't have all that beta carotene, that vitamin A stuff going on. Not as healthy, but still have other important healthy ingredients, obviously, nutrients. But sweet potatoes are just really, really great and nutritious. As far as varieties, you want varieties that mature early. The sweet potatoes take a long time, and of course, high nutrition and high producing. So varieties that we recommend are Beauregard. That's the one that we carry. Another really good one is called Georgia Jet. You can buy that online through catalogs, etc. They just have lots of nicely shaped sweet potatoes in good production. Sometimes people will ask, can I just take a sweet potato from the store and use that to start some plants from? And you can try that. I do not recommend that. Sometimes the sweet potatoes in the store have been treated with a chemical sprouting inhibitor so that they won't sprout, and so that would make it hard to start plants from. But also don't really necessarily want those chemicals on sweet potatoes. And also the varieties that you get might be a longer maturing variety that grows farther south than here. And so it might not make good sweet potatoes in time for growing here in our area. So you're much better off buying plants from the nursery, or like here at the community gardens, you can order them and they'll be ready for you when it's time to plant. If you do want to start your own, you can save your own, or if you find a nice sweet potato you like at a farmer's market, a local market from a local grower, you can start your own. Basically, a sweet potato are grown from slips, and that's just a nickname for a rooted cutting. And you can start this in a pot or in water. Lots of people have done the experiment where you take a sweet potato and stick some toothpicks in it, like in this picture here, and then the roots will grow out into the water, and these little tiny stalks will start growing from one end, and those are the things you can break off and stick those in water and let them get just a little bit of root. The mistake that people make when starting slips is, if they're growing them in water, is letting them stay too long in the water, and you get roots that are too long. You only want the roots to be about a 1/4 inch or a 1/2 inch in length, and then they'll grow quickly after that. If they're longer than that, they'll be very brittle and they won't make the transition from the water to the soil very good. So also, just when planting your sweet potato rooted cuttings or slips, you want to keep them out of the sun, keep the roots moist, and plant them quickly. Don't leave them laying out too long. So when you're getting ready to plant the slips, you're going to wait till it's warm enough. The soil needs to be warm, even warmer than for tomatoes. So plant your tomatoes first, probably wait another week or so, maybe even 10 days, then plant your sweet potato plants. Our sweet potato plants here at the community gardens, we get them in and then we put them in a pot, and the pot will hold a dozen sweet potatoes all together, and they'll all be bound together. So what you have to do is you have to pull them apart. So here you can see a person holding a sweet potato that's, was growing in a clump in the pot, and they separated them out. And you can see some more that are in the flat there, but they've separated out one. And sometimes the roots are extra long, and you might need to trim them off a little bit. In general, you're going to want to plant them about 12 to 15 inches apart. And if you're going to put the rows closer together, you can put them 3 to 5 feet apart, or farther if you want to. The plants are going to spread out and really run all over the place. But in the row, 12 to 15 inches apart. If you put them closer than that, you'll get very small potatoes. If you put them farther than that, you'll get large potatoes, which sometimes people like that. Other people don't like the potatoes to get too large. If we get something that's as large as a football, it's kind of hard to deal with. You got to chop it up and deal with it in order to cook it. But 12 to 15 inches seems to be about ideal. So if you have a 4-foot wide raised bed, you can put 2 rows and then just plant them 12 to 15 inches apart in the row. And you want to plant it deep, kind of up to the base of the first leaf that you see. So basically just all the part where the root is, you want that part to be on the ground, and the rest of it can be above the ground. And then you want to mulch it, put some straw or grass clippings around it, and then water it. And also I would recommend using lukewarm water here too, especially at the very beginning, because sweet potatoes do not like cold water, and that would be a shock for the little roots. All right, so as far as care after planting, you're going to be watering as they need it. Mulching, if you mulch, that'll keep down the weeds, because sweet potatoes will not compete well with the weeds, and it makes it hard to find out where the potatoes are if there's lots of weeds in there. And the vines will just run, and so they'll spread out. Sometimes, if they're going too far, spreading out too far and getting into your other crops, you actually literally have to take the vine and turn it around and sort of head it back into the center so that it's not heading out and covering up other crops. Sometimes people will say that you need to prune the sweet potatoes, cut off the ends of them in order to make them have more potatoes, and that is not true. In fact, if you cut them off, you can actually reduce the ability of the plant to grow more potatoes because you're cutting off leaves. The other mistake people make sometimes is putting too much fertilizer, especially the nitrogen, because what that does is that promotes lots of green leafy growth. The vines spread and get big and very lush looking, but then there's no potatoes because all the energy is going into growing the leaves of the vine. Generally, sweet potatoes don't have too much problems with insects or diseases, but occasionally they'll have problems with critters. Sometimes things like deer will eat the leaves. If you have deer, or rabbits will like to eat the leaves and little tips, but also things like voles and rats will actually eat out the tubers that are forming underground. As far as harvesting, that's usually going to be about the middle of September when the nights are starting to cool off. And what you need to do is figure out where this original plant stem, you planted that plant, where was that main stem? Because that's where all the, or most of the tubers are going to be formed around that. Sometimes you'll find one a little ways out, but typically this is right where the main stem was. So you just follow the stems all the way back to where that is. This little clump here has had the soil pulled back so that you can see what the clump looks like. That's how they grow inside, kind of all in a little circle around that main stem. And this is a really full clump. They're not always that full. So what you want to do is take a digging fork. Sometimes people call it a pitchfork, but it's the short handle one that has the flat tines on it. And sometimes called a spading fork. And what you want to do is come out a few inches from where that plant stalk was. Just try to, visualize what this cluster of sweet potatoes looks like. And what you want to do is come out far enough from the vine that goes into the ground, and then go down the side of this and lift up underneath and gently lift it up and loosen them from the ground. Occasionally it will happen. You'll stab a sweet potato right through the potato with the fork. And what that means is not that it's totally ruined, but you should eat that broken one first because it's going to not keep as long. But in general, you're trying to lift them up gently and avoid breaking them and piercing them with the spading. And as far as storage goes, they will store for a long time, but here's some tips that will help them store longer. Do not wash them afterwards because that sometimes promotes the fungus. Oh, by the way, here in this picture, you can see a spading fork. So that's different than a pitchfork. It's the kind that's very sturdy, used for spading up the ground and for digging up potatoes. The first week, you want to keep them dry and extra warm if you can. There's some really complicated instructions that you can find for what they call curing them, which means just drying them for storage. And people will say, oh, you need to have 80 degrees, 85 degrees for a week or whatever. It's kind of hard to do that in your house, but I find that if you, keep them warm and dry, just regular room temperature, 70 degrees, they'll keep just fine. And then once they've had that 70 degrees at least, they can be in a slightly cooler room, like 60 to 75 is great, perfect. You don't want to put them in a cold garage where it's going to get down to the 50s and 40s because you'll get cold damage on the tuberous roots. So store the roots separately if they've been damaged, like broken, or from the spading fork if they got pierced, then put those in a separate container and eat those first because they are not going to keep as long. And then as far as what to keep them in, you can put them in shallow cardboard boxes. Some people will put them in baskets. Plastic crates work well. Anything that gets you good air ventilation all around the potatoes. And the other thing is people recommend once you put them into this crate, don't move them around a whole lot. They say if you keep them in one place and don't move them, don't tip them over, don't turn them around, that they will last longer. They'll keep better. And so I do believe that is true. All right. Just a little bit of information about vegetable plants. Some of you have already been to Kansas City Community Gardens. If you're not familiar with us, we are a membership organization. You can go online and read more about it, or you can come to our office to find out about memberships. And memberships are based on your income level. The whole idea is to make gardening affordable for families of all kinds so that they can grow their own healthy, fresh produce and enjoy all the health benefits that come along with that. So we've already had the cool season vegetables. That's just winding down. You can still buy some of those if you're interested. Things like lettuce and kale, cabbage, a little bit of broccoli and cauliflower. But it's really just about the end of that planting time. But coming up at the end of April and the 1st of May, it'll be time for peppers and tomatoes and eggplants. And then after that, sweet potatoes. So definitely check us out. Check out our website. Come in and visit us. We have a beautiful garden here called the Beanstalk Children's Garden, which is open to the public starting in June 1st. And you can see all kinds of wonderful things growing there. We also carry seeds. With your membership, you get 10 packs of seeds. And then we also carry a special line of seeds that we call the Beanstalk seeds. And those are specialty seeds. Some of them especially appropriate for children's garden. Some of them are just interesting things that you may not find somewhere else. And you can actually order all these seeds online if you go to beanstalkseeds.com. That's the website. Just Google that, beanstalkseeds.com. It'll bring to your website, and you can order seeds online if you're not able to get to our office. Or if you have friends and relatives in other parts of the country, recommend our seeds to them, because that will help support community gardens and school gardens here in Kansas City. And they'll get good seeds. So I think that's it. Right now, we're going to take a look and see if there's any questions that Rob has for us.
Yeah, I just sent about 4 questions to your email.
Okay, let me look that up. All right. So the first question actually is about growing potatoes in a bag. Excuse me. The potatoes in a bag thing is something that's been around for a while, and you'll hear about that. You can read about it on the internet. And typically they're not referring to sweet potatoes, although you could grow sweet potatoes in a bag as well. But typically they're talking about growing the Irish potatoes or white potatoes. And all that is, it's using like a mesh bag to use it like a pot for growing in a container. And you can do that with the Irish potatoes. You can do it with the sweet potatoes. I think it's easier to grow in the ground. I haven't really tried the growing in the bag thing. I just know you have to be extra careful and not let it dry out. You have to get some good potting soil. So I think it's easier just to grow in the ground or even just in a regular container. But I don't want to discourage you from trying growing the potatoes in the bag. Part of the question was, can you just use like a bag from the grocery store, a paper bag? That would not work, because as soon as it got wet, it would just deteriorate. So it's a special fabric bag. The fabric looks very similar to like what's called landscape fabric that people put around their shrubs when they're planting them, and it lets the roots start to grow out through the edges and drains, and you just put the potting soil in there and plant some potatoes. So if you want to experiment, it's worth trying, but I think it's more work than just growing in the ground. All right, the question is, how often do you water to avoid blossom end rot? I would say you need to water once a week, assuming you don't get a good rain. That's why it's helpful to have a rain gauge. We talked about getting an inch to an inch and a half. If you have mulch down and you water once a week, the soil will never get so dry in between that you'll probably get blossom end rot. Some varieties seem prone to that more than others. I see it a lot on the Roma type tomatoes, but even some of the slicers will get it. And so what happens if people just aren't watering and you'll let like 2 weeks go by and you have a big drought and no rain happens, then that's what starts that blossom end rot. And again, it is because of the water uptake is uneven. So if you have mulch and you water once a week, the plants will have a pretty good supply of water all the time. Because what it actually causes it is the plant doesn't get enough calcium, and that's what makes that blossom end rot start. But that's because they're not able to have enough water to take up the calcium. So sometimes people try to put limestone on their tomatoes thinking that will help. And that's not the answer. The answer is to just make sure that they get even watering. So once a week, could be twice a week if it's really, really hot. And the mulch will generally solve the problem of blossom end rot. But once if you have a few tomatoes that have started, just go ahead and pull those off, get your mulch down, and then make sure you're watering at least once a week. Can you rotate tomatoes with sweet potatoes for soil enrichment? Yes. So we talked about rotating crops, and it does help with the soil enrichment as far as balancing out the different nutrients, but also more importantly, as far as the diseases, because sweet potatoes will not get the same diseases that tomatoes get. So it's a good alternative to growing wherever you grew your tomatoes last year, you can plant your sweet potatoes this year. So it is a good part of the crop rotation. The next question is, what kind of yield can you expect from sweet potatoes? Some of that will depend on if you take care of them, but if you take care of them, plant them at the right time, don't wait too late. You can plant sweet potatoes as late as June 10th or June 15th, but if you wait longer, sometimes if we have early fall, the sweet potatoes won't have time to produce as much sweet potatoes. So that's why really you're aiming kind of for that May 10th to May 15th, maybe even May 20th. That's the best planting time. And then of course, mulching and watering them as needed. And then that spacing, and give them 12 to 15 inches apart, and then you'll get the best yield. So what that yield will look like per plant is in the neighborhood of 3 to 4 pounds per plant. So if you think about that and you have a dozen sweet potatoes, you could end up with real easily 30 pounds of sweet potatoes, maybe even more. And that will be a lot of sweet potatoes, and they'll last you for a long season. So it's really one of the most productive things as far as poundage. Getting vegetables from your garden, you'll get a lot more pounds from sweet potatoes than from things like lettuce, of course. So sweet potatoes are just a great productive crop. And I think most people are a little afraid to try them at first, but once they've grown them a year, it's not so mysterious, and you'll get successful and have lots of great sweet potatoes. So I don't know if there's any more questions, but that's all that we've had in the chat. If you do have more questions, you can send them to contact@kccg.org, and we'll try to answer those for you. I don't know if you've got anything else, Rob.
Nope, that's all for now.
All right, thank you, everybody.
Have a good weekend, everybody.